So you can see from my CV that I mostly deal with things when they go wrong and when people are fighting with each other. And this is the issue with trust and accountability. Just about everyone always tells you you should do more of it. And it's the last thing you want to do when you're having a fight with someone. When you're having a fight with someone, if you suggest transparency, your idea of that is, why would I tell people more information so they can use it against me? And if you suggest accountability, you've got to understand in a fight, your opponents aren't being nice. They aren't just asking you to fix a few little things. They want to ban you. They want to close you down. So the idea of accountability is incredible. It's another part, looks like a part of the noose ready to throttle you. And you just don't want to do it. So there is a real problem with this, suggesting this as solutions when there's a dispute going on. So what I want to discuss today is how you deal with that and what part and role you have in it. The things I want to talk about is there seems to be a universal fixation when you're having a dispute to want to talk about the benefits of the situation, of your situation, and downplay the concerns, which is what helps this process. Why companies aren't more transparent in that situation, why they don't like those open and trans messages, why they feel wrong to them, and why it doesn't seem like such a good idea, and why it takes so long for them to happen. And how transparent should you be in the situation? You know, it's not, I don't expect you to tell every one of the company's secrets. It just wouldn't be good advice. Why accountability and trust are linked, and they're very importantly linked, and you can use them to your advantage. And, you know, the other issue that's linked with accountability is control. And it's something that rarely gets used, but is a far more effective strategy. So if you look at what happens in a fight, most people go with this strategy. And in fact, I took this graphic from the US Army's book to handling issues, their manual, and you wouldn't be surprised that their idea of handling issues is to have a fight. And you see this all the time. So you start off with supporter mobilisation, you're going to get all the people on your side, and you're going to, you know, empower them, arouse them and sustain them and get them fighting for you. And of course the people that advocate this mostly in companies are the people that are really good at it, the lobbyists and the government affairs people. They think it's a fantastic idea. I recently looked at a community relations plan for a major industrial site about to be built somewhere in Australia in about the worst environmental place you could possibly. If you're going to pick a place to build a chemical plant, you wouldn't pick this place. It has a list of 2 pages of endangered animals that they're going to potentially affect, and it just, you know, middle of a wetland, you wouldn't choose it. And this was their strategy. Their strategy was they even had a slightly canny version of it, is that they would hold information from the opponents and give information to the supporters a little earlier to get them on side. That wasn't going to help much. And of course the other issue that then you deal with is that most people think that you have to convince these people that are in the middle who haven't made their mind up yet that this would be a good idea. That, you know, that all your plans are good and that your process is the way to do it. And this is always advocated by, so you try to interest them in the issue because they haven't been interested to now, you try to convince them and you inoculate them, and inoculating is where you tell them what the opponents are going to say, so that when they hear what the opponents say, you've already got the answers. So if any of you are writing this down as a good strategy, you're missing the point of my talk. And this is advocated by public relations and marketing people. And they're very good at it, very clever messaging, that's what they do. And I am one of them, so I very much fall into this category whenever you ask me, until I think about it, that's what you should do. And of course the one that is the most common strategy that everyone just about agrees with is you should defeat your opponents. You should rebut them, you should impugn them, and you should beat them at every chance you get, because they're really the cause of the problem. The problem with this strategy is that this isn't how the audience works. The audience actually works in a completely different way. And the way that we try to think about it in this issues management approach that I'm suggesting is that you should look at it from the point of view of your worst critics. So your worst critics are in the centre of the issue, and what's happening is they have a whole pile of people who are watching their Twitter feed or reading their Twitter feed, who are watching the media that they've generated, and they are getting more and more involved. It's the involvement that is the problem. So, and what happens over time, so you first have the people highly involved, you know who they are, you've got their phone numbers, they're the people that are writing in the newspapers, they're the people that are putting demands on you. There's usually only a few of them and you know who they are in most cases, and you certainly do in this issue. And then you've got the people watching them, and then you've got the people watching the media, just browsing on. And the interesting thing about that group of people, what they're doing is watching how you're treating the people most involved and the people that are supporting them. And if you're treating them badly, that gives them a good reason to get involved. And what happens here is that that group slowly grows. So this is how you lose your social licence, because this group gets bigger and bigger until everyone thinks it's a good idea to ban you. Whoops. So back to social licence. So there's a whole process of social licence that you can see on issues over time where this is happening. It starts off as observation, people just noticing that there's a pattern going on, there's something they don't like. Then it becomes theory, and you start seeing some fringe groups involved and taking an interest in the issue. And then there's growing awareness, and the media starts, and then you get specific groups who target you and have a name, and so that's, you know, and that's where it starts to get far more interesting. And usually at this point it's growing quite quickly. Then eventually it starts to become an issue of research, government starts to get involved, and eventually there starts to be government policy, regulation, and then eventually it becomes a mainstream view, and everyone thinks that you should have been banned. And it's without question if you haven't handled the issue well. So if you look at some issues that we know very well, you can see the pattern of how it works. It starts out very slowly and increases in interest depending on how the issue was handled. So the orange-yellow one is biodiversity, and you can see where that is, and it's eventually now at the stage where people are starting to think about regulation in that regard. And with climate change, you can see that we've gone well past government policy, and we're starting to move into the stage where it's becoming a normal value in society. So the way to think about this is that it's a vortex, and more people getting sucked into your issue is the fundamental problem. And for those people in the audience who are on the other side of the debate, I'm not suggesting this is some sort of sinister plan that you're running. Usually what's causing the vortex is the companies involved, because they're fighting with you. You're simply usually just doing awareness about your issues. So there's not something sinister going on here. It's just those people are raising their issues, you're fighting with them and making it worse until the issue becomes bigger and bigger. So we need to understand why that keeps happening, because it seems pretty obvious if that's the case, you shouldn't do it. So the way to think about this is the mindsets that people take in any issue. So there are 4 mindsets that are possible. First one is that firstly there's a group of people who have no opinion about your issue at all. The real problem with them is they're not interested. They're apathetic about it, and why would they take any interest? But the communication theory is pretty good about that. If you want to convince those people that your company's good, that all the things you do have economic benefits, you should tell them about it. You should argue the benefits. That's what you should do, and you probably shouldn't tell them the negatives, because these people have no opinion anyway. So the best thing to do is give them yours. Then you have a bunch of people who agree with you. There's no point trying to convince them, they're already on your side. And all they can do is perhaps help you. This is that mobilisation of the supporters type approach. But the problem with them, they're probably bored. They've had enough of you, you know. They're probably sick of you. And of course you've got the people who vehemently disagree with your position, and the situation with that is you're not going to get very far with them. Arguing your benefits, the positives of your industry isn't going to get very far with those people. But the group that most people miss are the people who are somewhere in the middle. And these are the vast majority of people. So these people are ambivalent. And what most people don't realise is that the vast majority of the public on these issues, because they're not involved, they don't have a financial stake in it, have both views. And they can be counter-opposing views. You can have, I think a product should be banned, but I also think the product's good. They can carry both those views at once. So what happens in that situation, if you emphasise one side of that equation, they think the other. So it's not a great strategy to keep pushing your benefits in that scenario. And you can see, if you want to listen for this, listen to Talkback Radio. What Talkback Radio announcers do is they come out very solidly on one side of an argument, and lots of people suddenly call them back arguing the other side. And you can tell they're not the activists on the issue, because they usually know very little about it, which makes it very easy for the Talkback Radio host to put them down. But they are simply doing that process. When you push one side, they talk about the other. It's what makes talkback radio fun. In fact, if anyone ever comes on and knows a lot about the topic, the host will shut them off because he doesn't have the arguments for them, you know. So it's just what people do in their minds because they don't have a solid view about that issue. So if you sell the benefits, people with no opinion say, okay, I'll accept it. You're a little careful that if you didn't tell them all the benefits and didn't tell them some of the problems, later on they might be a little distrustful of you. The agree people say, fantastic, I really wanted to hear that, but you've got to be a little careful because even within your own companies you probably have some people who are somewhere on a scale of agree, and you might offend some of their views if you go too hard on it. The real problem here is with the disagrees is that every time you keep arguing benefits, you keep reminding them of how much they dislike you and all the arguments against you. So you yell louder at what your benefits are and they yell more about the reasons you shouldn't be here anymore. And it just reminds them more and more of why they dislike you, so you help create that vortex. And the other side, which is really important because these are the vast majority of people, are the people that are in the middle. So you're arguing X and you're making them think Y. So you're helping your opponents. So there's some very clear, and these are known as ambivalent seesaws, because they're for the ambivalent people only, that there's some very clear ones known in the research there's one about fault and responsibility, so the more the responsibility you take on an issue, the less you're blamed. The more you focus on how unlikely a risk might be, or how unlikely that something was going to happen, the more they focus about that if it did happen, how bad it would be. If you sell the benefits, they raise how bad the risk would be and how it would affect an individual or the individual animal. So there is these well-known seesaws that are going on in people's minds. They focus on the things you don't say. Oops. So we have some very good example of this in real life. I don't normally talk to people about their own issues when I'm trying to talk to them about a counterintuitive issue because they tend to be a little closed about it. But in this case, your own research is a really good indicator of this. So we did some research on those groups of people, the browsers and the inattentives. So remembering that the attentives are the people who are listening to your opponents, who think their arguments are good. The browsers are the people who are watching the media and watching on and they're not so sure. They think maybe the activists aren't telling them the complete truth and maybe you aren't telling them the complete truth. The top line is the research that we didn't do, but it was done beforehand, that just looked at the general feelings towards the industry of all the audiences. So a general public survey, and in this case, in live export, there was 13% of the public who were opposed, 32 who were somewhat opposed, 26 in the middle, 19 and 10. So what you can see there is what I would say is the start of a vortex, because what you can always see when these things are starting to happen is polarisation. The community's starting to get divided about the issue. The problem for you is the arguments on the negative are so much more believable for them that eventually the negatives will win. But let's now look at what we did. So what we did with this group of the browsers and the attentives is we showed them all your positive messages. So we had quite a few of them, and these are just a few so that remind you of them. I'm sure you know them well. It was a fact sheet. I think it ran about 2 pages. So these are just some of them, and we asked them to look at that information, and then we talked about it in a focus group. So this focus group only went for about half an hour on this part of the session. So what happened when we talked to those various groups? So this is selling your benefits. So at the beginning of the discussions for the attentives, and these are people who already have a problem with you. In fact, when we were doing the focus groups, none of them ate the ham sandwiches because no one realised most of them were vegetarians. So they reminded me that at the end very loudly, don't you worry. And it was a mistake, which I apologise for because I understand the blame and responsibility seesaw and said it was all my fault and I should have thought more clearly about it. But so at the beginnings of the discussion, 75% of them were strongly opposed to you. At the end of the discussions, in half an hour, you now had 81% of them opposed. So we had increased the opposition in a very short amount of time. Remembering them was showing them your positive messages. We're not discussing the problems in the industry, we're discussing all the good things. So, what really worries me is the people that are undecided who came into that room without, they were sort of opposed, but when you talk to them in a more balanced way, they had views on both sides, and you would think they'd be easy to convince. But this group of people went in half an hour, that 7.1% of them now decided they don't like you at all. So using your positive messages, this is what happened to the people that you would call ambivalent. So what's the solution to that? And I'm sure if you've had anything to do with Futureye, you've heard this before. The old-fashioned way to produce your messages is to get together, decide what you're going to do, then announce it and defend it. The other more transparent way is to declare your dilemmas, acknowledge the past problems, the current problems, try to work on a shared vision with the people who oppose you, and work out ways to evaluate it together. So it goes to all these issues of trust and accountability. So let's look at that, if you look at that in the same scenario. Let's say you ran that type of messaging with these groups of people. So you've got the no opinion people, and they simply say, again, I'm willing to accept the things you say. The more balanced messages don't upset them, they don't have an opinion. In fact, they tend to say, I'm glad you mentioned some of those negatives as well, because it seems to me a better way to do things. But they're not interested in your issue, and it's really hard to get to them anyway. The truth is, in the world, on these sorts of issues, there's not many of those people. People have opinions about animal welfare. You just don't find that group of people. The agree people are your real problem, because they're you. They're the people that work in the industry, they're the people who fund the industry, they're the people who fund the communications, they're your lawyers, they're your paid consultants, and they hate the idea of balanced messages. They just simply say to you, why on earth did you mention all the negatives? Surely that's going to make it worse. Because their gut feel tells them that. This is why this is counterintuitive, why it's difficult to do. Your gut feel is this is not going to work. So when you produce messages like this, you get the red lines through everything that you produce. You show it to your lawyers. They definitely don't like it. I'm always interested in the lawyers. I never give legal advice, but they always seem to be part-time communications experts, and most of their advice is about the communications, not about the legal issues, that they didn't like the way it looked. So when you question them, you go, what's the legal issue here? And they always say, I just don't like how this feels. That's not legal advice. So the disagree people, of course, what happens to them is they actually like those messages, because for once you're acknowledging the problems, you're acknowledging the things they've been raising with you for ages, and you're helping stop that vortex. And the great thing about this better approach is that the ambivalent people, for once, they do the thing you wanted them to do. You talk about the negatives and they actually remind you of the benefits. So you don't have to say it anymore. And if you think they didn't know about them, they do. They have strong opinions about these issues. Not strong, but they have a range of opinions. So they now think you're taking those issues seriously, and they don't think you have to worry about them. They don't have to worry about them as much. So they're less likely to get involved in that vortex. So this is why transparency in this situation works, and why it can feel better for you rather than feel threatening. So if you think about how transparency would work in a seesaw situation, you discuss the possible risks, and they start to think about, it reduces their concerns, and they start to have a dialogue with you about how you could reduce them, which you've already worked out. You know how to do that. Lots of people today have talked about that. If you acknowledge the past problems, they're going to blame you less for them. It's a blame responsibility seesaw working in your favour. If you acknowledge the current problems, they're going to have a dialogue with you about how to fix them again. If you announce your worst case scenarios, the things you're really worried about, the things that are going to go wrong, they're going to realise that they're probably unlikely, rather than you telling them unlikely and they focus on how bad they could be. So if you validate their genuine concerns, they're going to be more interested in the benefits. The other thing is, how far do you go? Most people then say to me, well, what about transparency? Would we tell them all our problems? It's simple maths as far as I'm concerned. I have a clear-cut answer for you. It's simply a bet. So the research shows that it is 20 times more damaging if you whistle blow on yourself before, or someone else blows the whistle. If someone else blows the whistle, it's 20 times more damaging. So that means if you've got some secrets that are anything less than, I think I get the maths right, 95% chance of being found out, then you should tell them. Tell them about it. You have a look at greyhounds. Were they in the situation with live baiting where they had a better than 95% chance that people would find out about it? I mean, it was 1 in 5 people under the McHugh report were doing it. And it wasn't just that 1 in 5 were doing it. The rest of the people were sending their dogs to their training camps on the weekends for them to be live baited, because it was how they thought they made faster dogs. So there was no chance that wouldn't eventually be found out. For Animals Australia, that was like shooting fish in a barrel. Like, just set some, I'm sure it was more difficult than this, but set some cameras up and you're going to catch them. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So simply ask yourself the question, if you're keeping secrets, if you think it's not going to make it worse anyway, transparency is pretty easy to work out what you should be open about. So let's have a look at greyhounds with the loss of social licence, because the pattern is well known. So the first thing you do is you keep a secret until the activists or the media raise it into the forefront of everything. You end up on Four Corners, you end up on the 7:30 report, you end up in the media, and now you look really bad because you've got that 20 times working against you. You then attack the people who did this to you, and in fact, in the greyhounds, the one thing, if you've ever read Paul Newsom's very good piece in the Huffington Post when he tried to come in and fix this problem for the greyhound industry, the one thing he noted was when, after Four Corners, they were obsessed about attacking the animal activists for having found them out. They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They didn't think anything. They weren't sorry for the fact that they caused that terrible injury to possums and cats and whatever else they were using, and rabbits. They were just angry about the fact that they'd been caught out, and they were angry and wanted to get back at the people who had done it. So that's the next stage of the process. In fact, most people don't remember that the McHugh report was started by them. That was their strategy. Their strategy was to put a PhD, a dog whisperer with a PhD, I think they called it, and they found McHugh, and they set him up to try and do a review after that event, and it got taken over by the government, and that's what became the Special Commission. So it was their own strategy. So, and you look at what they did once the ban came in place, they ended up negotiating a bunch of conditions that would kill their industry. 2,000 dogs, $1,500 bond, rock-solid guarantees to try and get their industry back. So they gave up much more than they would ever have had if they'd been more transparent. So the better way to do it, I would advocate, is acknowledging your concerns, working with your critics with those, sharing those dilemmas, committing to improve those issues, taking practical steps to do it, which a lot of the discussion's been about today, trying to work out a vision of how you could do this in a better way, and being prepared to be evaluated against it is the other option than the way that the greyhound industry did it. And if you think they got their social licence back, they didn't, because still 82% of New South Wales people and 60% of people in the country where they thought they had their supporters still agree the industry should be banned. They saved their regulatory licence through political pressure, but I think that they've still got a long road to go before they build any trust back with the community. It's possible. So let's think about the other thing. You won't be surprised to know that accountability and trust are also on a seesaw. So most of my clients are horrified when they find out that most people don't trust them. It just bothers them. And I understand why. We like to be trusted. We think we're good guys. We do the right thing. But if you ask for trust, you get trust less, because it's also on a seesaw. And so the way to deal with trust is accountability. It is, accountability is trust's secret weapon. The more, if you want to be trusted, you've got to find ways to be made accountable. So this is why it doesn't feel like being throttled. This is why it actually helps you. If people can check on you any time, and it means you can't cheat, they don't even feel like they have to check. So in often cases, even the offer of accountability improves your trust. If your issue's fairly well developed, they're going to want to check. With the mobiles industry, this was a good example of this, is that the activists were demanding many years ago, because we dealt with this issue probably 10 years ago, demanding the radiation levels of every model of mobile phone. And the industry at the time was, and for you always think, well, everyone loves mobile phone, how could that be a problem? But for them, their issues feel as bad as yours feel for you, and they had very good reasons why they shouldn't give out those figures. People will misuse them, they will start buying phones on the basis of these figures, and they're only compliance tests, and they were never designed to be used by that. And so more and more in the media, this issue kept coming up. The activists kept saying, why are you denying us this information? We have a right to have this information, and on it went, and the vortex over this issue grew and grew and grew. Activists found the information, they published it on sites, and eventually we were able to convince the industry as a whole that they should put the information out. So we set up at the time a global website. That information, by the way, is now in all your phones. You can see it in all your menus, and in the menus of the phone, which was the more latest step, but back then the website was the way to do it. Every mobile phone in the world was on a website with the radiation level. And over 12 months, the first 12 months, I watched it very carefully, because I told the industry that once they have that information, they won't be interested in it. So I was checking to make sure I was right, and then I advised them properly. At the end of 12 months, 30 people globally had looked at that website. And I know for a fact 10 of them were me checking the data. So the other one that is really missed by people is the link between accountability and control. And this is where my mobiles client aren't so good, but I use them as an example because it's the one I can remember where they actually did this whole process but didn't go as far as you should, and no one goes as far as they should in this. Control is a really hard thing to give to the people you're opposing. But let's say in a situation where you've got to deal with an issue, so their issue is when they build a base station, which is the core of their issue. Most people are not concerned about handsets, they're concerned when someone builds, and quite literally builds, a base station in your backyard. It's NIMBYism at its best, not in my backyard, because that is actually where they're being built. In fact, most people don't know, the law in Australia allows them, they could build a base station on your roof and you couldn't do anything about it, your suburban home. But of course they don't do that because it wouldn't be wise. But the government had given them the right to infill all of the in-stations so that we could all have 3G because of all the economic benefits that mobile phones provide. They gave them carte blanche to do whatever they liked. So in the early days, they weren't so silly to do that, but they certainly were building them wherever they liked. They didn't have to consult. The only thing they had to do was provide a predictive test of the radiation levels. So it's very simple physics, radio waves. So it's just maths. You work out the power, you work out the angles, and you work out the exposure levels, and the prediction maths was set so that it doubled what was really happening. So there was conservative nature built into it, so that everyone's going. So that's number one. There's technically this is all fine. There's no need to provide any more information. Of course, the community didn't see it that way. When a base station was being built in their neighbourhood, near a school, near a kindergarten, they want to know the levels. And they don't want to know what the prediction is, they want to know what happens when it's built, because they're concerned they're going to go up, you're going to put other base stations on them, what's going to just not happen after you've built it, what's going to happen in 12 months' time. They're all understandable concerns. So the industry, because they're starting to get good at this sort of thing, said, well, we better do. So the next level is, you develop the compliance tests and you say, we'll actually measure it. We'll show that we comply, and you explain that it was your commitment to safety, that you were a wonderful bunch of guys, you understand the community's concerns, and you have suddenly decided that, the next level of your safety program would be to run this compliance test. And the next level, which I think the one they eventually adopted, was sitting down with the community, working out how they wanted that process to run. They ended up running a community code and running a community compliance code together, all voluntary, but actually developing it with the community, and at least saying, we're only doing this test, we know it's not required, but we're only doing it because the community wants it, and we recognise the community want it. But the one that people miss out on is in this issue that in Australia there's only about 4 labs that do those tests. You've got to be accredited. It doesn't cost that much to do the test. They could have given the community, here are the 3 labs, keep one for yourself, here are the 3 labs that do the test, here's the money, why don't you do it yourself? Because if the community had then done the test, it's very hard to criticise the test that you've employed yourself. So control's another level, but it's rarely adopted. So near the end, by the way, one of the things I also want you to think about is the posturing that you do when you're dealing with your opponents. Is that most people are addicted to number one. That's where my clients mostly start. It fits into the previous slide, was they want to look like they are fixing everything. And it's the worst, least effective posture. The probably one you'd want to be at is the best, is to look like you're a team player, that you're working with everyone. You're involved and you're proud to just help out and solve the problems. The one that's the most effective is to look like you are being managed. And this is where regulation comes in. You're either being managed by the regulation, you're in control, other people don't have to worry about you because the controls are so good there's no way you could play up. Or your activists have you under control, which is even a better strategy. And they forced you to change. But again, these are inverse to how attractive they are to how well they work. So all I want you to do is think about that one. And finally, what I wanted to say is I realise that these issues are very difficult to get your head around, they're very difficult to do. So the way that I try to explain this to people is if you are in this situation, I understand the appeal of rejecting them. They are hard to do, but you've got to balance that with and see that it exists side by side. They are very effective. Other industries have done them, other industries use them, they work.